Welcome back, everybody. We are going to get started on our top semifinal here. Brian Wang on Esper Goryo going up against John Hubbard on Boros Energy. I did wind up getting both players deckless, so we are going to wind up seeing just a couple of turns have gone by, and we have an Ajani hitting the battlefield for John. On the flip side, we have Brian with, looks like, a couple of fetches and surveil lands, going to be just getting rid of some stuff, including this Ragavan that had hit the graveyard. Unfortunately, unable to do with the life total counter, so I am just going to wind up going off of what Brian has on the battlefield, thankfully. So having him down to 16, while both players are at 0-0 in this matchup head-to-head. But just a Thoughtseize here now coming out from Brian. Is going to decide to go after the Lightning Bolt, so leaves Guide of Souls, Static Prison, Amp Raptor, and Aether Hub in hand. Basically, everything that you kind of want if you're the energy deck, to be fair. Which makes me a little afraid for what Brian could have in hand. Looks like shocking down to 14 on top of that. All right, so we have Aether Hub hitting the battlefield for John. Looks like that we also, unfortunately, have had our microphone die, so we don't have player audio. That's what happens when you wind up having a 6-round tournament going all the way into 5:30, starting at 10. So you have Guide of Souls, we have Amp Raptor, that's going to gain John a life up to 21. Now we get the Amp Raptor trigger. Good old Static Prison. Nothing to do with it, so looks like we might just be opting to use the Static Prison to get some energy. But it is an opponent control, so it looks like now just deciding not to do anything with that and just going to pass the turn instead. Or not pass the turn, sorry, move to combat, because this is John's turn. John still has a lot of things to do. This was just in main phase. All right, no blocks. Cat should have Brian down to 12 unless there's a response. And looks like, no, just Tainted Indulgence coming out. End of turn, draw 2, discard 1. And pitches Atraxa, all right. This is Goryo's Vengeance o'clock. All right, we're fetching. Down to at least 11. Looking for a basic, probably. Find a swamp. Pretty swamp. As was pointed out a little bit earlier by Matt Wang. Or Matt Zhu. And just Emperor Bones. Pre-combat. Adapting. Exiling our Ulamog. That gets our Ulamog. That's a big old Ulamog. And that's just going to be it. That's going to be John backing up the game. Ulamog for Brian is going to take game number 1 off of the Emperor Bones. Now, for everybody who may have missed what was going on there, Emperor of Bones with the adapt ability here. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Emperor Bones, you can put a creature card exiled with Emperor Bones onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains haste, sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So Emperor of Bones, you put it on the battlefield, you go to combat, you wait for you adapt it, trigger happens, you adapt it so that card can immediately enter, and what ends up happening is the Ulamog will see itself in exile, enter the battlefield with 10 +1/+1 counters on it, because it is going to be getting counters equal to the biggest thing it has in exile, which is itself at a 10/10, and that is just 20 damage with Annihilator for John's board. So that's what wound up happening there. That's why John just scooped the cards up right there, and that's why we're going to be going into sideboards already here for the first semifinal. John going to be on the play this game. Taking a look at his deck list. Sideboard here, 2 Damping Sphere, 2 Fear Fire Foes. That's something that I may need to wind up looking up in order to figure out exactly what it does. It is a Lord of the Rings card, or the Middle Earth card, that says damage can't be prevented this turn, deals X damage to target creature and 1 damage to each other creature at the same controller. So that is just basically going to be something that can get around one of those 1 ring triggers. We are going to have, of course, Giganta the Wellspring coming in from this energy deck as a companion, 4 Obsidian Charmaw, 2 Orim's Chant, 1 Reprieve, 1 copy of the 1 ring in the sideboard to complement the additional 2 that are in the main deck, and then 2 Thraben Charm coming out from John's side. Now, taking a look at what the Esper Goryo's list is doing, you don't really have a lot of graveyard hate or anything coming out from John's side. You have Orim's Chant, so a player can't cast spells, and if a spell was kicked, the creatures can't attack this turn. That could be something to kind of work against the Goryo's deck if it doesn't have the Ephemerate to kind of rebuy the creature that is going to Goryo's out from the graveyard. Thraben Charm is going to be something that can exile a graveyard, and that's probably going to be 2 copies of that coming in. May wind up just seeing some of the redundant removal spells or effects, like burn damage effects, coming out. 2 Galvanic Discharge, 2 Lightning Bolt in the main deck here. Probably going to wind up seeing some number of those come out in favor of Thraben Charms and maybe the Orim's Chance. On the flip side here from Brian Wang's deck, it is handwritten, so it may be a little difficult for me to look at. We have Teferi, we have Mystical Dispute, we have a Spell Snare, we have 2 Dranith Magistrate. That could be something that comes in just to kind of prevent some of the Amp Raptor shenanigans. Celestial Purge gets rid of half of what John is going to be trying to do. 2 Wrath of the Skies, probably putting those in. Surgical Extraction, Toxic Deluge, also something very good at wiping out the Boros Energy deck. Nihil Spellbomb if you feared the Flage coming in, and then 3 copies of Consigned to Memory, which, if you're assuming that John is going to be on multiple copies of the 1 ring, maybe coming in. Consigned, we did also see in the previous round, being a good way to stifle the Ajani trigger to not let that cat flip over if John is going to be potentially setting something up where all of those dies triggers are very important. Looks like that both players have decided what their sideboards are going to be and are just shuffling up. That was a pretty fast matchup, though, as Brian is going to be taking that one just off the back of 2020 Ulamog, and John just not having the ability to deal with that Emperor of Bones. That may be something that you do wind up keeping Lightning Bolt or Galvanic Discharge in your deck for, and maybe Static Prison becomes the worst removal spell in your deck. You do have 2 copies of Goblin Bombardment. Maybe you can shave off on some of those if you're just trying to deal with the small things that Brian has to enable his combo, and then kind of go up from there. Thraben Charm hitting Graveyard means that you're not necessarily worried about the fact that, like, you're not going to be able to push through damage, because Brian's really not going to have any blockers or anything like that. So we are just looking at John, seeing if he's going to want to keep him what he's got. I think we may be on a mulligan to 6. Again, apologies. Do not have life counter. Do not have player microphone. Those are charging at this moment. And yep, John is just going to wind up shipping those back off. All right. Preserving my voice a teeny tiny bit. We still do have the finals coming up after this. One of these players will be there. On the flip side of the bracket, you're going to potentially wind up seeing Grant on Mardu Energy, or Wen going on Amulet Titan. So if John pulls this one out, we could have energy versus energy in the finals, which is, kind of the flavor of what people thought Modern was going to be post Nadu ban. But this Esper Goryo's deck, with the advent of Emperor of the Bones, we heard Matt Zhu talking about before, giving it more of like a mid-rangey kind of plan between that and the Frog. And just being a very resilient deck to have to deal with. So looks like John is going to wind up keeping his hand of, I believe, 6. Maybe that's a mulligan to 5. Either way, Parlor's going to surveil away a land. John's going to pass the turn. Brian fetch of his own. No immediate rush to pop that one. It's just going to pass the turn back to John. See what he's going to wind up doing here. Two mana for Johnny. And that's going to be no sort of consign shenanigans coming out from the side of Brian. So John's going to come on in, get itself a 2/1 white cat as well. Brian just going to crack a fetch, most likely going to be a surveil land, just see if we can wind up getting a Goryo's target in our graveyard as fast as possible. So Johnny Nactal Pariah going to be a very key part of this deck. As soon as the cat dies, and you got plenty of cats in your deck, it's going to flip on over and just kind of has that like battle cry, not battle cry, what was the war cry type effect. Deal as much damage as creatures you have to any target. Brian's life total is a valid target in that case. Atraxa is a valid target in that case. We are going to wind up having a shock in here from Brian, and that's just going to be Psychic Frog. All right, so we got the other angle of the deck here. Psychic Frog gets the battlefield, and we're going to have to see if John is going to be keeping in any sort of direct damage removal. We had Lightning Bolts. You can discard cards for that. Galvanic Discharge, you could discard cards for that. Static Prison, you can't discard cards to save your Frog through that. But with the mulligans that John has taken, does he have enough card velocity to keep going? Arid Mace is the land for the turn. Looks like one more land in hand and 2 unknown cards. 1 mana, maybe Goddess Souls? Alright. That's a start. And this looks like the freest 2 damage I think I've ever seen. Looks like a land, an Emperor, maybe an Ephemerate there from Brian. Yep, Brian just says, take 2. Goes down to 15. Ain't no reason to flip that to Johnny on his side. Just a pass back at the turn here from John. I think it's an Ulamog in hand there from Brian as well. So that could be discarded to the Psychic Frog any given point in time. Get a little surveil action going on. Looks like it might be something halfway decent. If it was a big old fatty that Brian wants in the graveyard, that was probably immediately going down there. If it's a land, we'd probably immediately throw that down there. It's probably a spell. Then it might be Wrath of the Skies I see there in Brian's hand as well. If that is the board wipe, that could be deadly for John, who is on just 2 cards in hand at this point. John having 3 lands in play. I believe that was a mulligan to 5 that he's been on. So his deck's kind of doing the best that it can. Maybe the sequencing of getting that Guide of Souls into Johnny could have been a tad bit better, but not going to complain. He's got stuff to do. Brian really tanking about this card on the top of his library, though. All right, decides he's going to leave it on top. Goes to combat. All right, are we going to chump block? Are we going to take some damage? This is the danger of a Psychic Frog on the opposite side of the battlefield. Most importantly, it is going to let Brian draw a card. And Brian just says, hey, I'm just content to deal 1 damage to you. John goes down to 19. That lets Brian draw a card for turn, or an additional card for his turn. Deciding not to pull the trigger on putting any sort of counters on the Psychic Frog, instead protecting it against any sort of burn spell damage that John may have in his deck. Brian, thinking about this Emperor Bones, decides to throw that one on down. This now gives Brian 2 low drop threats that John may have to deal with. So you're going to see him crack that Arid Mesa. Then we saw this Emperor Bones just running away with game number 1. John's just going to get another Parlor, Surveil Land, fix his deck, or top of his deck. Kind of good advent of these Surveil Lands in Modern, especially if you wind up having a mulligan situation like John has had here. This is just basically going to be able to help you fix your draw for a turn. Especially with the fetch lands at end of turn, it isn't really going to necessarily delay anything. Looks like Goblin Bombardment, I think that was the card there. Doesn't have power and toughness. Could be Arena of Glory. That would be a land. I think that's what it was. So pitches the extra land. I'm looking for action on John's side, especially on this mulligan to 5 like this. You need creatures to start generating energy and life. Start giving things flying. Maybe flip your Ajani. Amp Raptor. We're going to get a life. We're going to go up 3 energy. And what we got on top of the deck? Ragavan. That's not too shabby. So that's going to wind up coming on in. Generates an extra life and an energy. So we just go energy neutral on that Ragavan. John goes back up to 20. Now we have to decide, are we going to swing in with our cat? Are we going to swing in with Guide of Souls? Give it flying? Looks like we're just swinging in with cat. And yeah, we kind of want that cat to die, so I don't think we're going to really wind up giving it anything off of Guide of Souls. John's going to shock in a land, however, as Brian goes down to 13, and then just pass the turn, keeping 1 card in hand, 2 mana available. Taking a look at his deck list, represents Lightning Bolts, Galvanic Discharges, Orm's Chant, Reprieve, if that came in this matchup. And then Thraben Charm. Big thing coming out here to potentially hit the graveyard. Looks like Brian is going to fetch. Puts himself at 12, so I can assume that we're not going to shock in here. Let's see. Deck gets cut. And we got Psychic Frog going to discard discard the Ulamog. And we're going to quick read on the Emperor Bones to see, is there a way for this to be responded to? This is going to trigger at beginning of combat on Brian's turn. Now, without the player mic, I don't know if they're actually in the beginning of combat right now, or if this was just pitched on main phase before combat. I think you have to pitch main phase before combat. Just trying to remember my Grease Fang triggers. Now, of course, the Emperor Bones also targets, so if John has Thraben Charm as the last card, can use that in response to the targeted ability from the beginning of combat. So that's a discard, puts a counter onto the Frog. We also got Goryo's Vengeance in hand, though, from Brian. All right, here we go. Thraben Charm comes out, so this is going to be in response to it being targeted. Which means that it will not get exiled, just winds up getting targeted, and then you can exile your opponent's graveyard. So is Brian just going to Goryo's? Or is this even just letting... Oh, is this letting him exile it and then opting to use the deal damage clause? So what happens here? The Emperor Bones... Oh, the Emperor Bones dies, but it still just puts the Ulamog into play. So John, unfortunately, had the answer, but decided not to exile the graveyard before combat and instead went to remove the Emperor of Bones, and the Adapt was just able to be used in response. So that's it. Brian takes it. That's going to be Brian Wang going into the finals 2-0 over Boros Energy. Number 1 seed is going to be awaiting the winner of the number 7 versus number 3 seed in the finals.